Shabbat Shalom. Now with the holidays finally behind us, I'm getting a chance to get caught up on some of the news that I've missed over the last month. Did you know the Tigers didn't make it to the playoffs? And of course, I finally also had the opportunity to go back and watch the speech that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made before the United Nations about a week or so ago. And of course, that speech has now become famous for the 45 seconds of things he didn't say. Right? The 45 seconds he just stared out at the United Nations General Assembly, reflecting the silence that Israel has heard in the face of terrorist attacks, in the face of Iran threatening Israel. For 45 seconds, he just stood and looked at the members of the United Nations General Assembly. I think if I just stood and looked at everyone here for 45 seconds, they'd go on to Kiddush. But nevertheless, he was trying to send that message of the silence that we have heard with regard to Iran, with regard to terrorism. And he was trying to say no longer can the world be silent toward Israel in the face of all that Israel suffers. And by thought, because I had 45 seconds to sit there and think, my thought was Prime Minister Netanyahu. Time and again, the world has been silent toward the Jews. Not for 100 years, not for 1,000 years, not for 2,000 years. For thousands of years, the world has been silent in defense of the Jewish people and in defense of the Jewish nation. What do you expect now? And of course, there have been editorials thereafter, after the speech. Haaretz is the one that comes to mind, really castigating the Prime Minister, saying all that the Prime Minister is good at doing is speaking. He's not very good at acting. And ultimately, this editorial came to accuse him of adding fuel to the fire, which has become now the third intifada, of not being able to truly stand up to Iran, of not being able to create coalition partners to help him stand up to Iran. Right or wrong, these editorials have taken Prime Minister Netanyahu to task and said that that speech before the United Nations General Assembly, including the drama of the 45 seconds of silence, was a waste. And so I was thinking a lot this week about the idea of speaking and the idea of silence. As we turn to our Torah portion this morning, Parashat Bereshit, we see that over and over and over again, God is speaking. God says, let there be light, and there's light. God says, let there be trees, and there are trees. God says, let there be people, and there are people. All throughout creation, God speaks and talks and talks and speaks. And that is how the world comes into being. And in fact, we actually celebrate that each and every morning when we say, Baruch she'amar v'haya olam, blessed is the one who spoke, and the world came into being. Now, what's even more fascinating about that reality of God speaking and the world coming into being is that if you look at the other ancient creation stories, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Persians, their creation myths talk about gods fighting with each other, and that the world came about as a result of warfare and violence. But the Jewish idea of creation, how we believe the world was created, was not through violence but through peace. Not through warfare, but through the Word of God. What a much more beautiful way to talk about creation and the beginning of the world. Blessed is the one who spoke, and the world came into being. And as we go forward in the coming weeks, months into Sefer Bereshit, into this book of Genesis, we're going to hear over and over again God speaking. God speaks to Adam and Eve. God speaks to Cain and Abel. God speaks to Noah. God spoke a lot to Abraham. God spoke to Isaac. God spoke to Jacob. Over and over again throughout Genesis, we hear God speaking. And then, of course, we get to Moshe Rabbeinu, and God speaks a whole lot to Moses, because the remaining 4 books of the Torah are all about what God has to say to Moses. Throughout our Torah, we hear over and over again God speaking to us. But once we get beyond the Torah, we actually see God speaking a little less. Certainly there were prophets who existed throughout the generations. We have it in our Tanakh, in our Hebrew Bible. You can borrow Layla's. She now has a new copy if you don't believe me. God speaks to us. But somehow after the close of the Torah, somehow after our entrance into the land of Israel, God speaks a little less to us. And in fact, even some of our greatest leaders and teachers come to cry out to God and say, God, where are you? You spoke so often through Genesis, through Exodus, through Leviticus, through Numbers and Deuteronomy. God, you kept speaking over and over and again. Blessed is the one who spoke and the world came into being. But now you're going to be silent toward us. And so we come to Job. Of course, that righteous man, Job, who suffered so much. And Job says, I cry out to you, God, but you do not answer me. When I stand, God, all you do is look at me. Job, in the midst of his suffering, what did he hear from God? Very little. But after challenging God and challenging God and challenging God, finally at the end of book of Job, God says to Job, who are you? You want me to speak? Here I'm going to speak. Were you there when I created the world? Were you there when I put everything into being? Who are you to try to understand my ways? God says. And even King David, the great King David, who is going to be the ancestor of the Mashiach, the Messiah to come, the greatest king of the Jewish people, he cries out, and I'm now in the book of Psalms. Mizmor LeDavid, a psalm of David. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why so far from saving me from the words of my roar? Oh my God, I call out by day, but you answer not, and by night, but there's no respite for me. Even the greatest leaders of the Jewish people ask, where is God when we need him the most? But God spoke to King David. Even Job, the paradigm of suffering, calls out to God and says, God, where are you when I need you the most? And God ultimately spoke to Job. But do we see over this time this lessening of God speaking to our ancestors? And finally then we come to the prophet Amos. And God says to that prophet, to Amos, who lived roughly 2,500 years ago, behold, days are coming, the word of the Lord, when I will send hunger into the land, but not a hunger for bread, nor a thirst for water, but a hunger to hear the words of the Lord. People will travel from sea to sea and from north to east. They will wander about to seek the word of the Lord, but they will not find it. Amos famously prophesied about the end of prophecy. Amos spoke about the day when God will no longer speak, not only to the Jewish people, but to anybody in the world. And for the last 2,500 years, we have been all too familiar with the sound of silence. Now, our rabbis wrestled with the question, how could God all of a sudden 2,500 years ago stop speaking to us? We had this special relationship. We continue to have this special relationship. God, how can you stop speaking to us? There are some rabbis who come to teach in the Midrashim that ultimately God is punishing us for idolatry, and thus God stops speaking to us. The Talmud comes to teach that perhaps because not everyone who left the land of Israel during the Babylonian exile, not everyone came back to the land of Israel, God is punishing us because we decided to stay in exile there in Babylonia 2,500 years ago. There are others in the Talmud who actually say, no, that's not it. Our ancestors actually struck a deal with God. And they said to God, the worst evil in the world is avodah zarah, is this idol worship. God, if you eliminate idol worship from the world, then all will be well. And God says, but I believe in balance. So if I'm going to remove avodah zarah, if I'm going to remove idolatry from the world, the greatest evil, then I also have to remove the greatest good. And so the Talmud comes to explain that just as God eliminated idolatry, so too did God come to eliminate the gift of prophecy. And for 2,500 years, God has been silent. And I was wrestling with this, and I was wrestling with the Talmud, and I was wrestling with the Midrashim. And I was wrestling with this question of how could, in the face of everything we've gone through for the last 2,500 years, how could God be silent to us? And I couldn't find an answer. I didn't see a midrash that I agreed with. I didn't see a Talmudic teaching that I particularly liked. So I was reminded that if at first you don't succeed, do what your wife tells you. And so I was learning about this with Rebecca, my wife. And Rebecca said, what if, like a parent who is helping the child to grow, God speaks a lot to us when we were in our infancy. God spoke a lot to us when we were in our childhood growing. But as we began to speak, as we began to find our place as humans, as people, God began to pull back a little bit. God began to create room for our voice by retracting His voice. And actually this notion is found in the Kabbalah. It's called in Hebrew tzimtzum, the contraction. That in order to create space for humankind, God actually contracts Himself. And that just like a parent who's helping the child to grow, the parent pulls back in order to allow the child to grow, develop, make mistakes sometimes, but to learn from those mistakes. And perhaps no longer a parent of a young child, but God, who's now the Zedek of a much older child, or the Bubby, we can be gender neutral. What if this Zedek or Bubby, what if God then says to the Jewish people and to the world, I'm here when you need me, but you have to call upon me. I'm here for whatever it is that you need from me, but you need to reach out to me first. You're an adult now. That's what you need to do. And so maybe over these last many centuries, as what we have heard is silence, it's because we have not done a good enough job of calling out to God. Or maybe we indeed have done a good enough job of calling out to God, we just haven't seen with our, not with our eyes, but with our hearts, we haven't seen the role that God played in this world. And so I was thinking, following the Russian pogroms and following all the suffering that happened in Eastern Europe centuries ago, what did God do? Maybe He heard our voice of crying out to God, and maybe then God sent Theodore Herzl. Or maybe Theodore Herzl took it upon himself in God's silence to step forward and to make a difference. Maybe God heard our cries during the Holocaust, just as God heard our cries during slavery 3,000 years ago. Maybe God heard our cries during the Holocaust, and so God sent David Ben-Gurion, and God sent Golda Meir, and God sent Moshe Dayan, and God sent Yitzhak Rabin, and God sent the various leaders from this community who stepped forward when Israel needed it the most, when the Jewish people needed it the most. Some of those people, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents of those in the room today. Maybe that's how God speaks to us now, through God's disciples. Maybe God sent Rabbi Adler and God sent Rabbi Groner to help inspire us that we should call out to God ourselves, because God is waiting to hear from us. This parashah of Bereshit, in which we hear over and over again God speaking to our ancestors like they were children, maybe we are reminded that we are now adults and we need to call out to God. God is waiting to hear from us. And in addition to waiting to hear from us to call out to God, God is saying to us, you need to step forward to make a difference. You need to come forward. like generations of Jews here at Zedek, like Rabbi Adler, like Rabbi Groner, who stepped forward when Israel and when the Jewish people needed them the most. They truly stepped forward. They called out to God, and they made a difference in this world. Friends, Israel needs us. And not just the state of Israel going through the third intifada, but the Jewish people need us today. We have people in this room, doctors and lawyers, businessmen and philanthropists, parents, grandparents, children, who are able to call out to God like nobody else. Let us this week of Parashat Bereshit, let us truly call out to God with our prayers. Let us seek God with our actions, but even more than that, let us step forward with our feet and let us extend our hands to help the state of Israel, to help the Jewish people. God is only silent until we reach out to God and ask for help. This Shabbat, let us begin to call upon God with the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts. But let us also reach out to Israel, to the Jewish people, and to all those in need throughout the world with the work of our hands. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may this be God's will. And let us say together, Amen.